Well, welcome everybody today. We're delighted that you're joining us for this presentation on the PEGI project. It is something that we've been working on for some time. And okay, so the PEGI project is an effort to develop a national agenda on the preservation of electronic government information. A very brief summary. This is an effort being led by librarians and others at this list of institutions: University of North Texas, UNC Greensboro, Arizona State University, University of Missouri, Yale, Stanford, and the Center for Research Libraries, and also the Educopia Institute. Broad range of institutions that are working on this multi-year project to address these national concerns. I'm going to give you in this presentation first an overview of the PEGI project, its precursors, antecedents, and so forth. Then we're going to go to an interactive group discussion of three core questions, and we would very much like to hear your thoughts regarding a variety of issues involved in preservation of electronic government information and ways of addressing this issue nationally. Finally, we'll briefly go over information on how you can participate in next steps in the PEGI project, and we very much like to invite everybody that's interested to participate in various ways. This is me. I'm the Dean of Libraries at the UNC Greensboro University, and I also am president of the Educopia Institute and been working on this for a while. So, Linda, if you can put up now our results of our poll. So we have a number of people who have answered other in the category of disciplinary fields. A lot of librarians, not surprising. This does seem to be an issue that I think many in the library community have a fair amount of concern about. And and it's good that a number of people are somewhat optimistic about this. No one is very optimistic, but we have some optimism, so that's great. We had 30 of 36 attendees responding. So a mixed group today, which we very much wanted. That's great to see. And again, when we get to the interactive portion of this, we'll have a little more time to get feedback from you. All right, so this first part, the overview of the PEGI project and its predecessors, it does have some background. It's arisen from a long-standing interest by librarians, especially those involved in the Federal Depository Library Program, who became concerned over the years that there was not a great deal of attention, or we felt enough attention being devoted to preserving electronic government information as opposed to print information. There have been a number of efforts in the past to address this issue. PEGI project is building on those efforts with the intent to broaden this conversation and try to develop a national agenda around this topic. Just a brief summary of some of the precursors that have happened in the past. There was a Gateway project in the early days of the GPO access program. That this effort ended in 2000, but it was an initial effort to try to preserve some of the electronic information out there. There's also FDLP Content Partnerships Program, and then of course more recently the so-called end-of-term crawl project or end-of-term web archiving project that has attempted to preserve web content off U.S. government websites. There is also a budding effort in the TIPNet effort of the, or alliance of the GPO that is still sort of getting off the ground, but has a lot of promise, we think. All of these were efforts to try to preserve electronic government information, but we have some thoughts about this to share in the PEGI project. There's also, we want to highlight the work of the two James Jacobs, well-known individuals, librarians that have been working on preserving electronic government information for a while, James at San Diego and James at Stanford University, and they run the Free Government Information website. There's also the affiliated archives of NARA that we'd like to highlight that do work in this regard. They mostly preserve print information, but there are efforts going on within them to preserve electronic information. So with all this, well, you might ask, well, so what's the big deal if we already have all these efforts? Why should we worry about the possibility of loss of electronic government information? This is the U.S. government, right? All that information is just always going to be around. It's going to be safe and secure. Well, a lot of us have become concerned to increasing degrees in recent years, and there was a particular ratcheting up of our concerns in 2016 for reasons that are probably obvious. There are a lot of 404 errors when you go to try to access information in government websites, and this particularly picked up because of these issues. This is David Rosenthal, a Stanford researcher, who's categorized a range of reasons for loss of digital information that are primarily not technical. They are often, human-related reasons, especially the one that's last on that list, organizational failure, is an increasing reason for losing information. We held a couple of summits in 2016 that led to this project, the PEGI initiative, in San Antonio and in Washington, D.C. They highlighted a series of issues and are listed in the source down at the base of the screen, 2016 report that came out of these meetings that highlighted all the reasons that information is falling through the cracks. While we have pretty good workflows for preserving print government information through the FDLP and other programs, there are a lot of categories of information that it basically means that electronic publications of various kinds are not getting preserved in many cases, or are not understood as information that needs to be preserved, or that is not folded into the workflows of existing efforts to preserve government information. And we were concerned enough about this even back in early 2016 that we wanted to do something about it, get this project started. We did apply for an IMLS grant that I'm going to discuss shortly and got this effort going, but there were a lot of other things that affected the landscape, and concerns over preserving electronic government information have really now exploded. There was a sudden advent of many grassroots efforts in the first months of 2017, efforts that you may be familiar with, data rescue efforts, the Libraries Plus network, the PEGI group preserving geophysical data, and a number of other efforts that we're still sort of inventorying right now in this project. The need, we think now, is no longer raising general awareness of this issue. Rather, we think now the need is for documenting the perspectives on this issue from the many different stakeholder group concerns and their perspectives, and trying to develop a shared agenda for addressing these concerns. So a purpose statement off our website, and much of this, again, you can get off the PEGI Project website. It's just PEGIproject.org. It's a multi-year initiative to address national concerns and develop this shared national agenda regarding preservation of electronic government information by cultural memory organizations for long-term use by the citizens of the United States. And the focus is, of course, at-risk government digital information of long-term significance, which is not being adequately preserved via the web or other automated means. We have a series of goals in the project. I won't go through all of these, but we are undertaking scans of various kinds. And I'll highlight that last goal, that we really want to try to surface shared recommendations from a variety of national stakeholder groups for a collaborative agenda to do something about this issue and not just be concerned about it. The project that is this particular webinar that we're in today is a part of was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, thank you IMLS, through an $87,000 grant to conduct a series of national forums with different stakeholder groups, disciplinary groups, and so forth, again, to try to surface what we think is out there, a broadly shared set of national concerns through these facilitated discussions. At the end of the project, we will create a published report documenting all of these topics. Again, these are our partner institutions. The mini forums, or what we're calling mini forums, with all of these disciplinary groups are listed here. And you can see we have a broad range of these meetings. We're trying to reach out to historians, scientists, certainly the American Library Association, archivists, digital preservation specialists, and others. And then we're also doing these 2 webinars. This is the first of them that are going to try to reach out to just everybody who can't be at one of these in-person meetings. We will conclude this IMLS-funded project with a national forum in Washington at the end of this year. And we're going to try and bring in attendees from all these different stakeholder groups that are interested in this topic and work together to develop this report that will constitute a national agenda, we think, that has broad representation from different stakeholder groups. And hopefully that report can serve as a blueprint for subsequent mobilization and coordination of efforts in the future. Okay, so I am now going to transition. I'm going to hand off for the next part of this webinar to my colleague Marie Concanon from the University of Missouri. And are you there, Marie?
Yes, I am. Well, I'm Marie Concanon, one of the PEGI project team partners, and during this segment of our webinar, I'll be leading an interactive discussion. So just to give you a bit of practice with the chat box and to make sure it's working for you, you can go ahead right now and just type the word hello in the chat box and make sure it says send to everyone. Well, as Martin mentioned, we're going to be asking your thoughts about 3 questions. These are the same questions that we posed at the forums mentioned earlier in this presentation. Each group of participants that we work with is unique. We know that we'll receive some overlapping responses today, and that's fine, but expect some new and different answers as well. It's all good. So we're going to have about 13 minutes for each question, more or less. So that's plenty of time for us to get a good conversation going on each one. So let's go ahead and dive into the first question. Question 1. Are there categories of electronic government information, that is, digitized records, databases, and other digital information types, that you think have long-term value for research purposes? If so, describe briefly in the chat window. Now, as you're thinking about that, I want to let you know that our PEGI project partner, Scott Matheson of Yale University, will be giving voice to the comments that you share and covering as many as time allows.
So Marie, one of the first responses is that Data Rescue Boulder, Joan says, has a list that they use individually, which maybe we want to hear a little bit more about from Joan. And other folks have said electronic court records, websites, machine-readable data sets, tweets from public officials, yeah. Another vote for court records. So data sets has brought up again as a +1. Brandon also talked about that, particularly NOAA and some of the geophysical data. And that was certainly the thrust of the data rescue efforts, in part because the Environmental Data Governance Initiative were involved in that as well, and it came out of Penn's Environmental Humanities group. So a lot of that data was at least, if not harvested, was definitely categorized and that effort definitely looked at that. Now, of course, the question is how do we make that, how do we work with that going forward? So Emily actually says metadata, which is an interesting, so even like data.gov, just the metadata catalog would be an interesting set of data to make sure we preserve. Gray literature, records, and email, again, so those are on our archival side.
Marissa privately said to me, born digital records on legacy media.
So born digital records on legacy media, so emails on CD-ROM or USB sticks or something. Am I understanding that correctly?
Okay, looks like we're getting some really good feedback here. So I'm going to give a few more thoughts for you to consider as you're answering question number 1. One way to approach this question is to think back to when you very first heard about our project, Preservation of Electronic Government Information. Tell us what electronic government information meant to you, and if there's any part of that which is especially important for your own work. Another way to approach this question is to think about researchers of the future. When they look for government information that was produced in the 2010s, what sort of information do you think they will want to see the most? And while you're thinking and typing, I've got another little teaser question. Because we have participants on this webinar today representing a variety of fields, as you observe colleagues in your own field, what sorts of electronic government information seems to be most important to them? Now, I'm a librarian, so I know what other librarians are thinking about a lot of times. And if you're in the history field, or if you are an archivist, or if you are, I don't remember the different things people said in the other box when we started out with the poll. But anyway, we have a lot of fields represented. Scientists, that's great. Now you can continue entering comments in the chat box as ideas come to mind, but I would like to show you now some of the responses we received to this question at previous forums. Now if you see anything here that especially resonates with you, go ahead and use the chat box to echo that comment, or add to it if you wish. And Scott, what are you seeing popping up?
Well, a lot of folks interested in official correspondence, email, so there's definitely some archival piece there, but then some interesting things that sort of go more on the data bucket, which are things like data collection protocols and data documentation, metadata around data sets. And that makes a lot of sense, if we get just a giant blob of microdata, that's wonderful, but it doesn't really mean anything if we don't have the data dictionaries and the instrumentation documentation that goes with that. Another category seems to be court records and briefs and sort of more transactional materials, meeting logs, calendars, and records of rulemaking. And I'm wondering if records of rulemaking also means things like public comments received in the course of that rulemaking, that sort of interactive transactional work that the government does in rulemaking. Again, lots of votes, it looks like, for the environmental and climatological data, including national snow and ice data from Boulder, collected there. And then several people who are interested in, again, sort of the court records and briefs, but also legislative history and records of lawmaking. Sort of fits together with the records of the regulatory process as well. So you would want the people who are interested in the legislative side as well as the regulatory side, but sort of all of those process-based documents for history, legal history, legislative history, that sort of thing.
Fantastic. We're getting such good feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you all for all your active participation.
When Emily has mentioned regional air quality data, I will say that regional is one of those things that came up in the course of data rescue and has certainly comes up again and again. And going way back in the print days to fugitive documents, regionally issued documents or regional materials from regional offices could be particularly difficult to find and make sure that it gets into the system in the right way. So those regional resources are particularly important as well. That's a great point, Emily.
All right. The chat box seems to have died down for now, so I think this is probably a good time to move on to question number 2. Question number 2 is, If you identified any categories of electronic government information in the previous question, do you think that there are any potential risks that might threaten the long-term survival of this information? If so, describe briefly. Now remember that you can use the scroll bar and scroll back up if you want to remind yourself of some of the things that got typed in response to question number 1. This is some great comments and feedback coming in.
It's moving awfully fast, but I will say that it looks like a lot of our science folks, maybe the earth science and more engineering concerns, are sort of these historical standards and specs, as well as the ability to continue to process historical data that may be stored in obsolete formats, either physical formats or obsolete file formats. Definitely an issue and one that we're starting to see some motion on in terms of emulation and emulation as a service. I know that LC and some of our folks here are working on that to make old software, for example, available to run to use data that it may be in obsolete file formats. Some ideas about sort of the ephemeral nature of online materials generally, and then these sort of the items that Martin mentioned or summarized from FreeGovInfo about the threats to online information, organizational change, or failure on the technical side as well. Eileen Snyder mentions a lack of infrastructure and workflows for preserving electronic government information and lacks of requirements for preservation. So sort of a nice way of saying that we're lacking some of the technology, the workflows, and the actual getting things done, but also the policy side, the requirements for management and preservation, and the way to get those two to work together. So Laura bringing up ideas about sometimes things fall out of the traditional workflows because agencies may bypass regular acquisitions rules, or that agencies that are downsizing or lack infrastructure to maintain their access, Brandon has brought up. I think that's an interesting one. So not necessarily agencies or commissions that are ceasing operation and would end up in the cyber cemetery, but where just through sort of attrition in the agency and a change in priorities, they don't necessarily maintain access to that permanent public access to what we would think of as their publications or perhaps their information dissemination products. So an interesting idea at the state level, it sounds like maybe there have also been some ransomware attacks, which sometimes can encrypt data and lock it up, so that might create data loss that way as well. In addition to, Tatiana mentions just plain old digital rot, and that I think goes back to the Stanford list of just organizational change, and as things age, they tend to disappear from the web if somebody isn't taking care of them. Great ideas on things that are actually at risk, not just obsolescence of formats or obsolescence of data, but lack of funding. So again, that technical side and the policy side. And Nora actually mentions lack of understandable metadata on data sets. I think that's really important to underline the importance of, it's not just this giant file of data. You really have to understand what that data means. So all of that metadata around it is really vital.
This might be a good time for us to show you some of the risk categories that we've identified so far. From some of our previous forums, we received a lot of examples of materials that were at risk for data loss, and looking at them all, we found that they could be grouped into some categories. And on this slide, you'll see some of the categories we identified. As you look at these categories, it might make you think of some additional categories that aren't there, or it might make you think of some very compelling example that falls into one of these categories. Compelling examples always help a lot when one's making an argument, so take a look at some of these. What we found was loss based on the nature or format of the information product itself, and that would be like a floppy disk, or that variety of thing. Loss resulting from change that takes place too rapidly. Loss resulting from budget or funding problems. Loss resulting from a misunderstanding the needs and requirements for data preservation. Loss due to political or legal situations. Loss due to insufficient leadership on the issue. I want to actually give a shout out to our PEGI project colleague Sherry Laster, who really focused in on the risk category quite a bit. She wrote a very nice blog entry that's posted on our website, and it's largely because of her advanced work that I was able to put together this slide right here. So thank you, Sherry. Maybe seeing some of these categories will give you additional thoughts about question number 2. Now, if you don't have a chance to put your thoughts in at the chat box today, or if you should think of something later, there will be additional ways to contact us if you get additional ideas, and we're very much open to receiving comments from you today or, tomorrow or next week. So keep that in mind as well.
We'll put up a link at the end of this presentation for an online survey that you can fill out to give us more fleshed out thoughts.
So Scott, has there been anything new in the chat box that you
Sure.
want to cover?
I think that Nora brings up a very interesting point about full text keyword searching becoming kind of more and more the norm, and that means that we may be losing some of that human indexing and the controlled vocabulary work that makes discovery of some of these things, some of these reports and documents more reliable. And she gives the example from the MESH subject headings of heart attack versus cardiac arrest versus myocardial infarction. And of course in MESH we know it's the last. But if you're not tagging your documents, if you don't have an indexer or a cataloger working with the data that you're collecting, even if it's preserved, it may be difficult to find, which is an interesting point that I'm not sure fits exactly within any of our previously identified answers. Definitely sort of, I can see a lot of those categories on the slide leading to the issue that Nora identifies, but I'm not sure that we specifically called that out as a way to do that. Jennifer also talks about, and so this is sort of one of my hobby horses, is the idea that this data and publication series are most useful and most valuable when they are continuous. And this any failure to preserve or to protect our local collections from disappearance really is a problem in terms of keeping all access to all of the data at the level of granularity that researchers in the future may need. So I think that's
Okay.
it.
I think this is a good time for us to move on to question number 3. We have a little extra time for question 3, it looks like, which is good because this one is actually the most complex question of all, and it's going to take us a little bit more time to cover. But it's also the most interesting, and this is an area that you can really help us. Question number 3 asks, do you think that there are any useful strategies that could lead to better coordination of efforts by academic or public organizations for purposes of digital collection, preservation, and access? And do you see any logical priorities, opportunities, or barriers to such collaborative actions? Now that's a lot to bite off, so let me break this up into smaller pieces for you all. Okay? So first of all, let's think about the players, or who would be involved. This question asks about academic or public organizations. What organizations do you imagine could be involved, and which do you hope would be involved? You can go ahead and enter your answers into the chat box now. In a way, when you type in the name of an organization, you're giving them a very big compliment because you're expressing confidence in them. You've seen the work that they've done in the past. You think that they've done a good job of it, and you really hope that they might be involved in something like this as well. So don't hold back. Some of these organizations may be nationally known, and some may be not. But you can type in anything here. So what are you seeing, Scott?
So I'm seeing sort of the big three that we tend to think of when we think about this: GPO, Library of Congress, and NARA, which are great, and we got several folks voting, quote unquote, voting for those. I think that's great. Emily had an interesting idea kind of right out of the gate, which is community foundations, and that sort of leads to several other folks, including Eileen Snyder, said state archives, state libraries, or municipalities. And I think that's an important thing to remember is we tend to think about the federal level materials because they affect everyone, but as with the regional materials we talked about before, I think a lot of state level and municipal level things may be sort of, going back to question 2, in some of the most danger because of funding and prioritization needs in those organizations. So individual state archives. So a lot of, and research libraries have come up, as has the American Bar Association. So I'd like to maybe think a little bit more about that, or maybe Michelle can expand on that. But an interesting idea of sort of a professional association or a series of professional associations might be preserving some of this information, or could be at the table at least. And again, Joan also says industry might entertain this sort of idea of pro bono work to help us understand. I think she means, she says from a technical perspective, but I think they can also, in addition to the resources, also guidance and just ideas about what's really important. She says IT industry can lend the how while academia can lead in the what. So we can help identify what our researchers need and maybe predict what researchers of the future might need, and other partners could help us figure out how to preserve that. Great. Emily points to a technical partner, which I know a little bit about, as Civic Switchboard is sort of a little bit more local, a technical partner on the more local level, which is great.
So here's another way to look at it. Think about what are some organizations that have expressed interest in digital collection, preservation, or just access to government information. Can you name a few of those? And they do not have to be well known at the national level. Any organization that has expressed some kind of interest in digital collection, preservation, or access to government information.
Well, while we're talking about other potential partners, I will just point out that some of our galleries, art galleries and museums, some of them are governmental, and some of them do have government information in them, and they may be interesting partners as well. They definitely have a lot of the same preservation issues that some libraries and archives have, though their materials tend to be rather different. We don't always think of them first, but they do have some shared expertise on the preservation side. Generally, a lot of folks saying professional organizations, which I think is great, including, looks like also alliances of local governments, Southern California Association of Governments. I know we have regional alliances of governments in New England as well, which could be interesting. Folks who are organizations who are specifically focused on preservation of information, like the Legal Information Preservation Alliance. Hi, Margie. Jessica actually brings up the National Transportation Library, and I know other folks have said NLM and PubMed Central, so let's think about all of our national libraries is a great way to get folks involved. And another community foundation. On the tech side, CCAN, the folks who make some of the repository software. That could be an interesting voice to have at the table as well.
You know, I think I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next element of this question, which regards any collaborative action we might undertake. What would you think would be the logical priorities? In other words, where should we start? If we started by focusing on particular digital materials, what would those be? You can also think in terms of what would be the easiest place to start, or what would be the most important place to start. We're looking for your thoughts about what would be the logical priorities for any collaborative action.
Starting there typing on this, I'll call back to one entry I saw quite a ways up the scroll here, that staffing issues, especially in state and local archives, could be particularly problematic in terms of recruiting and retention. So that might be both a barrier, but then an opportunity or a priority is to increase education and professional development, sort of the pipeline of folks who are aware of these issues and want to work on them. So Joan points out that FTP servers are relatively easy to harvest, and I would agree that from the data rescue efforts that the pages that couldn't be easily captured by the Internet Archive, the next easiest thing was the FTP servers. So those are potentially low-hanging fruit, though also perhaps a priority from the at-risk side as well, because they could be targets internally from IT folks. I know ours are never too happy about plain FTP in terms of security. So that may be both a relatively easy and a somewhat perhaps more urgent set of materials to work on. Points out that this is the first EOT harvest that included FTP because of some software changes that the Internet Archive was able to make to their harvester software. It looks like we grabbed 100 terabytes of FTP data, which is a lot. That's a lot of data. Alrighty. So other folks have brought up sort of more these policy barriers. Eileen says that getting groups of organizations to agree to an MOU or that sort of a agreement can be tricky, and just in terms of the bureaucracy, I would imagine. I know at my institution that would be. Michelle suggests that we focus on documents that are have a history of being neglected, things like administrative agency information that might be moved or changed or just left to erased at the end of an administration. And that can be a change in administration for all of the presidency, or even just in terms of a change of, for example, Secretary of State may cause a change, an update in the website. So interesting, Jennifer says uniform guidance for information producing entities. And somebody else had mentioned to me that perhaps we should be thinking about the people who actually produce the information as well, sort of capture it earlier in the information life cycle, which has definitely been something that folks have talked about.
Yeah, that's an important one.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like some people have already moved into the barriers. That's okay. Let's let the conversation move that way. We do know that there will be barriers. What are the barriers? Let's think about what they might be so that we can think about how to overcome them.
Mm-hmm.
Think of what those barriers might be, and if you have an idea about how it might be overcome, feel free to type that in too.
Emily says accessible digitization strategies for paper records. So I'm wondering, Emily, do you mean specifically accessible in terms of making sure they're OCR'd or they're accessible to folks with print disabilities? Or do you mean just making the strategies themselves available so that everyone can see what the strategies are for digitizing paper records? That's an interesting challenge.
On the positive side of this, the question does ask if you know of any opportunities, some special opportunities that would lead to collaborative actions. An opportunity can be maybe the opportunity for grant funding. Maybe you know of some entity or organization that has developed a strong interest in this, even though they're not really closely allied with libraries or archives. This is kind of in a way, it's kind of like a fishing question because we don't know necessarily what all the opportunities might be out there, but if you have an idea or a thought about an opportunity for PEGI to move forward, go ahead and put that in the chat box now, but continue to think about it as well, because that might be something that comes to mind later.
So it's interesting, Margie brings up this idea of technical barriers, not necessarily meaning that there isn't the technology or that people It's more that people can't agree on which one to use, or that they may not all have access if you're putting together a collaborative project, which is certainly something that we've run into. I know we all say, oh, well, we'll just use O, but we can't let people outside the institution. They have to have a net ID in order to be able to get into that. Or, they're not on our network or something. So definitely that sort of everyone having access to the same tools is an important consideration. And then lots of folks saying money, and as you say, of course, funding can always be a good incentive to develop some collaborative action. And Catherine brings up the great point that really having clear roles for everybody in the collaboration really is an important step. And I think that's one of the things that we hope will come out of our project this year is sort of some identification of some gaps and some agreements on how to move forward, ideas on how to move forward, and then folks will be able to claim those gaps. I think it's great opportunities upcoming there, I think.
Okay. And the last part of this question, it's about coordinating efforts. We're looking for strategies that could lead to better coordination of efforts. So tell us, what examples have you observed in any professional settings of really great coordination? Are there any models for coordination that have impressed you? It looks like we have just 1 minute left on this, so at least on this group facilitation part. So Scott, you want to just do a final 1 minute wrap up, and then we'll turn it back over to Dr. Halbert?
Sure. I think we've seen some great, some new ideas and new approaches to some of these questions, and we've seen some real reinforcement from this group on some of the things that we've heard from other groups, which is sort of not surprising to me, but it is reassuring and nice to see us sort of begin to see sort of a cohesive set of issues and concerns and ideas that people have, while still bringing in these great new ideas of new things that people can use, new tools, new ideas for collaboration. I think this is a good productive discussion we've had.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Now back to Dr. Halbert.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you everybody who gave us that feedback. That was remarkable. It really fleshed out a lot of thoughts that we've had and feedback we've already gotten from some stakeholder groups. Okay, then, in the last few minutes of this session, we do want to extend an invitation to anybody to participate in PEGI Project in some of our next steps. First, if you are interested in, and if you have a particular stakeholder group that you can represent the perspectives of, do consider joining our group of stakeholders who are going to convene at the concluding shared national agenda meeting. It will be held in mid-December 2018, and we will be planning that meeting well in advance of December and actually doing a lot of pre-work on developing a draft of some kind of the project report and this national agenda. So if you're interested in this, let us know as soon as you can, and we'll back you into the discussions. We think that this will be a great way to bring together different perspectives, different kinds of groups from the national, at the national level that have an interest in preserving electronic government information and ideas for how to do that. Finally, if you are interested in this topic and want to fill out a survey of these 3 questions and, give a little thought to a little bit longer answer, if you get interested in this, please consider filling out this 3-question survey. It's a short survey, so it won't take you very long. And that's the link, the bit.ly link to it. And again, this will be put up on our website as well. We'll have a link to the survey and the slides. So let me bring us to a conclusion, and if you get interested, please contact us at info@pegiproject.org. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar today. We got a lot out of it. I hope this was interesting to you all as well. And please stay tuned for more information on the PEGI project. And if you have follow-on thoughts that don't fit into the survey, please consider just contacting us with any thoughts that you might have as well. So with that, let me thank all of our presenters and our project people, and also everyone who participated in the webinar today. Thank you very much.